So we have been saying quite a lot of bad things about price ceilings in the last couple of videos, and we have learned how it leads to a host of different problems for the consumers, and we have already seen that the producers, they are also hurt because of these price ceilings. Simply because the government is forcing them to charge a price which is less than what they were doing in the free market, and at that price they eventually end up selling fewer units than they were doing before. Now, once we know that because of a certain form of government interference, in this case because of a price ceiling, once we know that this interference is hurting the consumer and the producer, then we should also know that a more technical way of saying the same thing is that this price ceiling will lead to a lowering of or a decrease in the consumers and producers surplus. Why? Because consumer surplus, remember we simply said, is the benefit to the consumers, and remember that graphically we said it is the area above the price line below the demand curve. So if we are saying that a price ceiling will hurt the consumer, then the benefit to the consumer will be less, that is, the consumer surplus will decrease. The producer surplus, on the other hand, remember we said, is the benefit that the producers get from participating in the market. And graphically, we said that producer surplus is given a supply curve and a price line. Producer surplus is simply the area below the price line and above the supply curve. Now again, price ceilings, if we know that producers are suffering because they are receiving a lower price, they are ending up selling fewer units, then of course they are getting a lesser benefit than before, which in turn means the producer's surplus will also decrease. So to really nail your essay answers, once you have given all these sort of negative things that come out after a price ceiling, including shortages and black markets and this and that, end your answers by saying that, overall it leads to a lowering or decrease in the consumers and producer surplus. And since consumers and producer surplus are, I should say, the sum of consumers and producer surplus is equal to the total welfare of the society, if an interference through a price ceiling lowers the amount of consumer surplus and the producer surplus, it means that price ceiling therefore lowers the total welfare that is being generated in the economy. So through that link, you can say that price ceilings, they cause inefficiency because they cause a lowering of total welfare measured as the sum of consumers and producer surplus. Now with that in mind, if you know all of this, which is pretty simple, you should also be able to simply show this decrease in consumers and producer surplus on this graph of demand and supply. You may get an essay question on it and MCQ that needs you to be able to read off the consumers and producer surplus when there is a price ceiling going on in the market. Now that is pretty simple. So for that, all you need to first of all realize is that initially, again, let's use this market for petrol where we assumed a price of 150 and an equilibrium quantity of 100 in the free market. Now in this free market, let us just start off by marking out the initial consumer surplus, which will be the area above this price line and below this demand curve. That is usual way of mapping out the consumer surplus. The producer surplus, on the other hand, in this free market initially would be the area below the price line and above the supply curve. Again, the usual way that we always depict the producer surplus by. Now, if there is a price ceiling of, let's say, 75 rupees, that means that the 75 is the new price that exists in the market, and let me just keep it till here. At this new price, the quantity supplied will be less than before, and if you remember, we assumed that this new quantity supplied will be just 70 rupees or 70 liters. Now, what will be the new producer's surplus? You see, producer surplus will still be the area below the price line and above the supply curve, horizontally out up till the quantity that is still being traded in the market. Now, after a price ceiling of 75, the new the new price that the producer is receiving for every unit is 75. So this is the new price line effectively for the producers. So area below this price line and above this supply curve horizontally up till this new quantity QS. Why? Because as you see at this new lower price, although there are a lot of consumers and there is a lot of quantity demanded, but since only 70 units are being produced, there is only these 70 units that will be traded. The producer is only going to sell these 70 units. The rest of this extra demand, remember, is just going to create the shortage in the market. So producer surplus, area below the price line above the supply curve. And you can easily see that, look, from this entire triangle capturing the initial producer surplus in the free market, the producer is just left with this small part at the bottom. So the producer is really hurt. He gets a lesser price per unit than before and he sells fewer units than he was selling before. So he loses producer surplus. Now what about the consumer? The consumer, again, remember, although his quantity demanded will increase up till this point. So let me draw it out over here. So at this new price, quantity demanded is up till this point. But all of this distance here is the excess demand. This is the shortage, because since only 70 units are supplied, the consumer will only be able to buy these 70 units. So we can again sort of draw an imaginary vertical line over here. This will just remind us that any unit beyond these first 70 units, it is not being traded in the market anymore. It's not available. So it's just these 70 units that are being purchased and sold. So as far as the consumer and consumer surplus is concerned, consumer is going to pay a price of 75. So his consumer surplus, so let me do that in black, his new consumer surplus will be the area above this new price line and below this demand curve, but only horizontally up till this vertical imaginary line that we have drawn, because all these units between QS and 100, they are not being traded anymore. They are not available in the market anymore. So the consumer surplus is just this blackish area over here now. So what's happening is that the consumer is having to pay a price of 75 per unit instead of 150. So that is sort of what benefits the consumer. But then only 70 units instead of 100 are, the consumer is only able to buy 70 instead of 100 units. So overall, to the right of this 70, the new quantity that is being traded, any unit that was being provided in the market and was being purchased by some consumer, all of these units between 70 and 100, they are now not being traded in the market. Remember, the market has again shrunk. And since these units are not being produced and therefore not being bought, so any consumers and producers surplus on all these 30 units, on each unit to the right of this imaginary line or this triangular part over here, all the consumers and producer surplus that was initially there for the consumers and producers to earn or gather in the free market, as soon as the government interferes, puts a price control, the market shrinks to just these 70 units, and all of this consumer and producer surplus on those units that were previously being traded but now they are not traded, all the consumers and producer surplus is lost. So this, again, this triangular area can say is the dead weight loss of a price ceiling. And therefore economists would say that price ceilings, they create inefficiency. They cause a loss of consumers and producer surplus, which is just entirely lost to the society. This is not going to the government. This is not going to any other economic agent. It's simply lost to the economy.